Right. In the earlier sessions, we have discussed about the importance of solution architecture and how solution architecture we develop based on the non-functional requirements, all these. Next, we have discussed even about enterprise architecture, all these. As part of learning solution architecture, this is something essentially required. At the same time, what are the models? Something like C4 model, all that were discussed. Today, I'm going to discuss about solution architecture document. Because when we have created an architecture, that has to be translated into a document format so that technical team will understand this well better. So for that, it is always important for us to create some documents like wherein this can be categorized into an introduction part, need to mention about the solution overview, business context, conceptual context, etc., solution architecture concept, all that. The first one about introduction, where we have to mention about the document purpose, for what purpose we are going to prepare the document, and what will be the scope of the document when we are preparing. Because scope, nothing but possibility, I can say. Followed by who is going to go through this document. This is where we call it as document audiences stands for. Means to whom are we referring? This document you are preparing for what? Generally, this we will be preparing from the benefit of the technical team to understand the technical roadmap so that whatever the technical solution by implementing business logic will be developed by them accordingly. This is where this document audience is, right? So all these things are comes under picture. This is point number one. So point number one, majorly focusing on the purpose, scope, audience, all that. Next one about solution overview, because here we need to mention about the solution, like you need to mention about the solution objectives. Next, we need to mention about the scope of the solution. What are the possibilities we have to develop? This is where generally scope of the solution stands for. Objectives, solution objectives are important. Point number one. Next, solution scope. What are the possibilities we have? So either it can be an in scope or out scope that we must be knowing. So objectives followed by the scope are important. After a solution scope, the next is about assumptions and constraints, because in scope, as I mentioned, which is in our limits. This is called, we call it as in scope. Out scope, nothing but what is not in our control is called out scope, means deviation in requirements. Okay, so if there is any changes happens in the design, all these things are comes under out of scope part. So in scope, out scope, that we need to mention. Next, what are the assumptions and constraints? Because when we are developing a solution for any of the requirement, when we are developing, assumptions are needed, right? So what are the key and important assumptions that we need to consider when you are providing a solution? What are the key assumption areas that are to be focused and that are to be addressed here? Either it can be a technical assumption, it can be an operational assumption, right? So all these things. Next, constraints. What could be the possible constraints? So there are different things, scenarios we need to understand. Let's say sometimes we are developing an application from the scratch. Okay, so whatever the infrastructure that we have designed to develop the application to support, to develop and as less to support to use it remains doesn't have any issues to us. But when it comes to the uh, migration projects, let's say we are migrating from old legacy systems to the new application, there could be some technical constraints might be taken place, because whatever the infrastructure we have used earlier, let's say we have used some on-premise solution where now we are moving towards cloud. So the transformation and how the staging database to be created, what kind of technologies and technical constraints that are to be taken into account, all these things we need to mention. This is comes under assumptions, constraints, all that. Next one, dependencies. I can say, I can call it as project dependencies. This dependency can be of anything. It can be, let's say, for example, we are developing a cloud application, a banking application. Dependency can be, this can be connecting with some other CRM applications to access the data. Because CRM applications are used to manage customer relationships, etc. So for that regard, it's important for you to explain about what are the dependencies, interconnectivity between this cloud application with some CRM. So these are all comes under the dependencies point of view, constraints, dependencies. Next, what are the key architecture decisions we have taken? These decisions may be varied from organization to organization because architectural decision to be taken, we need to have a clear understanding about architecture vision. You need to have a clear understanding about architecture scope, solution, and what are the architecture patterns that we are using. What are the design patterns? That is all comes under the architectural decisions. These are all we need to consider. If I want to understand, if you want me to give you an explanation about the architecture pattern versus design pattern, if you want to make it very simple for you to understand. Architecture pattern means, let's say you're going to construct a building. Whatever the building are we constructing and whatever the external elevation of the building requires, that is what we call it as architecture pattern. Now, what is design pattern then? Design pattern means, let's say whatever the interior you are constructing in the building, right? So you are creating an interior for a living room, right? So either it can be for kitchen, right? So or it can be for other rooms, right? So whatever the interior we are going to create for a building inside, that comes under the design patterns. So these design patterns different from place to place because the design what we see as far as color combinations, grandeur, simplicity, right? So everything varies from place to place. If it is kitchen, then it is a different structure. If it is a living room, then it is a different. If it is dining, that is different. So it depends on the area where we are creating an architecture, design and all that will vary. In the same manner, when we are developing a solution, design patterns depends on the kind of solution you are going to develop. These design patterns will vary. This is where generally all this comes under the key architectural decisions, whatever the architecture principles that we are following. Because if you are going to create an architecture, we need to prepare different principles that we need to follow. And what kind of decisions are we taking in? What are the different patterns that are required to follow? Everything comes under this direction. Next, business context. This is where generally we need to understand the business capabilities because you are developing a solution roadmap, a technical roadmap, wherein that must be aligned to the business capabilities of a business or an enterprise. That must be aligned to that. So then only whatever the solution you are going to develop will have a value as far as the usage is concerned to the customer. This is where generally business capabilities are comes into picture. Next, what are the key business requirements? What are the different key business requirements that we have that we need to be taken into an account even, right? So what are the different business requirements? So business requirements majorly focusing on business goal, vision, scope, right? So what is the mission statement, right? So everything comes under the key business requirements and followed by the kind of business processes that are involved, right? So what are the key business processes that are involved within the application, followed by the kind of users. I mean to say these users may vary. Users nothing but people who are using the application are called as users. So business users need to be varied over here. And moreover important and all, the non-functional requirements are also one of the key and prominent area. Non-functional requirements majorly focusing on scalability, load balancing, fault tolerancing, all these. These are all comes under non-functional requirements. Non-functional requirements majorly defines you this, right? So what are the non-functional requirements? Scalability, availability, reachability, right? All these things are comes under non-functional requirements. These are all comes under the business context. Next, conceptual solution overview means when you are developing a solution architecture, what kind of business concept was taken by us to develop it. That's where generally conceptual overview comes into account. Next, solution architecture. And when we are going to develop a solution architecture, this is where generally We need to know about the information architecture. I'm talking about business information. What is that are we going to carry in the next coming application in the next level? Next, what are the different data objects that are used to manage the inventory within the application itself? And we need to know about the application architecture. What are the different types of applications we have and how these applications were interconnected? Some applications may be an on-premise application, some are cloud applications. Then interconnect is something which you must be knowing. Next, application inventory, right? So when you are managing application, there are required inventory which will be inbuilt in the application itself. That's something which must be knowing. Next, integration architecture. Integration means wherein you need to connect with hardware and software. So this integration part comes under the integration architecture. Next, interfaces. Whatever the user interfaces, UI and UX designing you are creating to create some front pages, everything comes under interface inventory. Next, infrastructure. To develop an application, you require some infrastructure to be built. It can be an on-premise or it can be a cloud infrastructure, because now and then we are using cloud services and all. Cloud infrastructure you need to understand. So cloud infrastructure you must be knowing. Infrastructure architecture, I can say. Next, to manage that infrastructure architecture, there are some repositories that are to be managed with or that are to be created. That infrastructure repository is required. Next, to develop a solution for that application, you require some security to be maintained. That's where generally security architecture comes into picture. Next, to manage the securities and all everything, we are using different IAM processes, something like SailPoint. You must be knowing about. So there are different IAM processes we are following as part of securities concern, something like SailPoint, right? So all these things are comes under these, followed by the threat models. Everything comes under this. These are the major areas as part of the document. If from the solution documentation is concerned, is what something will be discussed in this. Next, we need to know about solution management. Solution management majorly focusing on what are the different operation management processes that are required to follow, and how are we managing the incidents. Like for example, we are using different incident management tools. We are using something Bamboo normally we use for releases. OpsGenie. OpsGenie is one of the release management, instant management tool we use. OpsGenie, right? So all these things that has to be mentioned. And what is the methodology that we are following to manage and restore the data and backup, right? So how you are backing up the data, right? So how you are restoring the data. So how you are doing the data retention, right? So these things you must be knowing. Next, end user computing followed by user onboarding. All these things are comes under solution management. One solution management, the next is solution delivery considerations. Means what are the different developmental considerations we need to consider? What are the different developmental areas that are to be focused more? Because final one solution was created that has to be delivered, right? So that how the solution consideration that we are going to provide, and what are the different deployment consideration that we are providing over here, and how the data migration, because most of the projects now and then, as I said, migrating from old legacy systems to the new application. This is where data migration comes into picture. So how are we migrating the data from one extent to another extent? This is where data migrations comes into existence, data migration considerations. Followed by what are the different application decommissionings do we have? Everything will be part of solution architecture document to be prepared as part of solution architecture, apart from the designing what we have done. Right. So this is all about the session today. And tomorrow I'm going to discuss about the first one, right? So I'm going to discuss about what are the key and important elements that are to be focused more on, right? So, and how the document can be prepared. So these parts and all everything that I'm going to discuss about these in tomorrow's session.